Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade in the 769th year of the 41st millennium. A year significant for seeing one of the largest and perhaps the most pivotal battle during this portion of the Imperial Crusade. The battle for the Hive world of Verghast. The planet was a major manufacturing and refinement center on the coreward side of the Sabbat worlds. The planet's remarkable industrial output owed much to its interesting local political structure, where dozens of noble houses spread across the major hives, such as Vervunhive, Ferrozoica, and Vervunhive, competed with one another to fulfill imperial tithes and trade demands as swiftly and efficiently as possible, thus gaining status, recognition, and authority in turn. Obviously, there were several other levers of local power being acted upon by the various families, but this, the world's value to the wider Imperium, was one of the greatest and most important to be acted upon. This in large part due to the planet's long and boisterous history of internecine conflict. See, the Imperium doesn't really care if a planet is currently engaged in a bit of civil war nonsense. So long as the Imperium's tithes are fulfilled, they view this as an entirely internal matter, and, in essence, no business of the Imperium. What is the Imperium's business, however, is aforementioned tithes. And it is therefore quite common for participants in a civil war to appeal to the Imperium for aid by offering them a greater share of the planet's resources, or by simply claiming that they are capable of delivering the tithe, whereas their opponents are not. And obviously, whichever party gets the Imperium on its side is going to have an enormous advantage in any kind of local conflict. And so, as a result, whatever house currently holds the most favor with the Imperium holds a lot of political power as well. The power to call upon Big Brother for aid, or to keep Big Brother out of it, should the political party in question decide that a bit of a more ambitious cleansing is in order. Naturally, all of these rules fly right out the window when chaos or Xenos activity is involved, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. As one can handily imagine, the world's industrial output of course made it a tempting target for Chaos forces during the collapse of Imperial governance in the Sabbat worlds. However, Verghast nevertheless lived a rather charmed existence, as Chaos did not attack the world. But why? Surely access to Verghast's industrial capacity would be invaluable, not to mention its natural resources, which is of course all true, but all of that local industry, along with a long and proud history of local warfare, meant that the planet was also very heavily defended. The largest and most dominant hive on the planet, Vervunhive, was not only protected by enormous, heavily fortified armed and armored curtain walls with shield generators and massive bastion fortresses, but also by a standing army of 500,000 Vervun Primary armed forces. These were not to be recruited from in the case of an Imperial Guard regiment's raising. They were trained, equipped, and armed solely for the defense of Vervunhive. They even boasted significant numbers of main battle tanks, of proper Imperial-grade Lehman Russes, self-propelled guns, and tank destroyers. And on top of this came another force of a further 70,000 auxiliary troops, second-line reservists. And in addition to this would be whatever militia troops could be raised from the local populace, numbering in the tens of millions. Even if Anarch Nadzibar had brought the full might of his military force to bear on Verghast, the world would have taken years to conquer at the very least, and quite probably decades. The industrial capacity of the planet, which would on all due likelihood be reduced to dust anyways, was simply not worth such a tremendous expenditure of time and resources at a time when the Anarch's primary goal was to rush as far forward as possible to establish his shield against the Imperium. And so, due to circumstances outside of its control, Verghast was spared Chaos's attention, and now that news came of the defeat of the enemy at Balhat, and the unstoppable, gloriously victorious advance of the War Master Makaroth's forces, it seemed as if Verghast would never know the touch of chaos. But, as they say, if something appears too good to be true, that's probably because it is. But to see precisely how, we need a bit of a change of perspective and time, as we head back to the Battle of Balhat, where within the first 5 or 6 odd days of the war beginning, both in the void and on the ground, it became apparent to those with the perspective to see that this was not going the arch-enemy's way. And whilst loyalty unto death is a common feature found amongst the zealous lower ranks of the Chaos armies, it is a very rare trait indeed amongst its commanders. And as it so happens, the commanders are obviously also the ones in possession of this perspective required to see when a campaign is just not working out very well. Therefore, it should come as a very small surprise indeed that many of the Anarch's chief lieutenants began abandoning him the moment it became clear that he could not pull off a victory on Balhat. One of these commanders was Heritor Asphodel, the leader of the Heritor College. He had previously been quite a pain in the Imperium's neck on 2 previous occasions, primarily because of his obsession with creating woe machines. Mechanical monsters of insidious complexity, the likes of which the Imperium had rarely seen before, thus enhancing the rumors that he was in some way attached to the Adeptus Mechanicus. But of course, he was not shackled by their limitations or doctrine. Thus, Asphodel was more than happy to introduce other aspects into his machines, demons or infernal sorcery, letting him create weapons that would be, well, quite literally, physically impossible. This put him pretty high up on the list of Chaos leaders that the Imperium wanted hunted down and dealt with as soon as possible. In a serious effort to track down Chaos leaders was, of course, undertaken after the crushing victory on Balhat. And whilst there were some successes, like, for example, the capture of Shoal and Skara, nothing had been seen or heard of Asphodel after the defeat on Balhat. This, in all due likelihood, was because, while so many other magisters saw this as merely a breaking of the front line, a setback from which they and their unmatched brilliance would of course recover, Heritor Asphodel instead saw a major strategic failure. as he had significantly more vision than your average war leader. Thus, instead of falling back to the nearest world and beginning to rearm and reorganize, he set his sight on a true prize, a world that had so far been bypassed, the world of Verghast. As we've already covered, the world was a valuable prize for the forces of chaos, but an outright invasion had been deemed too costly and too risky an undertaking. But as Asphodel had no doubt been forced to abandon the vast majority, if not indeed all, of his forces on Balhut to guarantee his own escape, bearing in mind yet again that the world will have been surrounded by Imperial Navy warships at the time, then, well, Heritor Asphodel was not likely to have a surplus of military forces to waste anyways. For him, it became a do-or-die gambit, where if he succeeded, he would gain control over billions of individuals, and a manufacturing base large enough to equip this new gargantuan army of cultists. And if he failed, well, he would be dead and unremembered, and would therefore hardly be overly bothered by the outcome. But even an unarmed lieutenant of chaos is far from harmless, of course. He had no doubt already studied the history of the world of Verghast. He had looked into the various trade wars that had ravaged its surface, and so he picked the Hive most likely to be willing to do next to anything to get revenge upon their enemies. The Hive of Ferrozoica, which had lost a recent, massive and pivotal trade war to Vervunhive and an alliance of other Hive cities. Ferrozoica, therefore, and its master were desperate. They were at their lowest ebb, and vulnerable to a kind and well-meaning stranger arriving from somewhere unbeknownst to them, who promised them riches, who promised them technology, and who was capable of delivering as well. Can you imagine what a mind like Heritor Asphodel could have done to the mining output, for example, of Ferrozoica's mines, or the mechanical wonders he could have created with little to no effort? Now, yeah, sure, the new drilling machines might have moaned weirdly at their operators, and the cranes, walking by themselves to the construction site, might have some additional wiggly bits here and there, but it was restoring Ferrozoica's honor, so who would dare question it? And as the Hive welcomed with open arms one gift after the other, the Heritor's status within the Hive would naturally rise and rise and rise until he was whispering in the ear of its ruling noble classes, and eventually in the ear of the Hive's High Master himself, and others willing to listen as well. Thus, by the time of the year 769, Ferrozoica had fallen completely under the sway of Heritor Asphodel, who now would begin moving against the other major hives on the world, in an effort to secure the entire planet, preferably swiftly, so as to prevent any outside involvement. He had laid certain plans for this, but even the plans of the great enemy does not always survive contact with the foe. We are, however, getting a bit ahead of ourselves. In Vervunhive, news of the brewing war arrived, to no great excitement, really. Ferrozoica was rising yet again, the traditional enemy was stirring, But shortly after their major defeat in the previous trade war, another conflict would be a swift and decisive affair, quickly resolved in Vervunhive's favour, now that it was under the command of the next generation of Hive Masters, High Master Sondar, who had taken over from his illustrious father, the man who had defeated Ferrozoica the last time around. Plus, Vervunhive still enjoyed the Imperium's favour. It had along with it representatives of the Imperium. It possessed its finest war machines and a significant professional military. It seemed complete and utter madness for Ferrozoica to march to war now. Not that it really mattered, of course. General Vergolian of the 1st Vervun Primary Armed Forces Armoured Divisions mustered his men and issued forth from the great hive city of Vervunhive to bring the war to the enemy, and the conflict to a quick and a resolute end, as he was planning to destroy whatever minuscule forces Ferrozoica could have been able to muster together on such short notice, then join together with the other allied Hive forces, like the northern colonies, for example, and the Hive of Vanvik, before moving on Ferrozoica itself, besieging it and defeating it. And coming along for the ride was the Imperium's highest-ranking representative on the world, Commissar Pius Kaul, who had been dispatched by personal order of the old War Master Slado, a sure sign of the Imperium's favour. The city itself, Vervunhive, was unlikely to receive any sort of damage or danger, and thus work shifts and everything else continued as per normal. But General Vergolian, leading the Vervun Primary Armoured Forces, was in for a little bit of a surprise. He had, by quite some margin, cleared the outskirts of the city, the enormous mining complexes and the countless smelteries, where he encountered the first element of the Ferrozoican forces. These were evidently the rapid scouting elements of the advancing host. It was impressive that they'd managed to get this close to Vervunhive without anybody noticing them, and it spoke to a significant degree of mobility, but again, it was probably just a maddened rush to try and catch Vervunhive off guard and establish some sort of a cordon or a siege pattern before the Vervun Primary forces could break out. Well, that had already failed, and all General Vergolian needed to do now was smash these advanced upstart forces. They were equipped primarily with light armoured cars and some armoured personnel carriers. Nothing before his mighty force of main battle tanks and self-propelled artillery. He smashed apart these leading elements only to be faced with yet further reconnaissance forces following up behind them, which he smashed in turn, even as yet further forces began to appear on his flanks. This was evidently, by the sheer scale and scope of the opposing forces, not merely some far-flung advanced scouting force. There were thousands of armoured vehicles all around his troops. They were absolutely no match whatsoever for the Lehman Russers under his command, blasting them apart by the dozen, but more appeared every moment. Was this perhaps some new form of tactic, some attempt at hyper-mobile warfare to rush down Vervunhive or cut off and separate his own armoured elements from the safety of the Hive city? If that was the case, it would be a flimsy attempt. All he need do was either burst through it or turn around and drive back to the city gates. But just as the thought formed in Vergolian's head, it was interrupted by the whine of heavy shells, as artillery began to bracket his positions. And nothing light either. This was no desultory mortar barrage. Enormous artillery shells that could only have been flung from self-propelled guns of equal size to his own earth-shakers were raining on his position in seemingly absurd numbers. General Vergolin was not the foremost military commander of the Vervun Primary for nothing. He had seen plenty of live fire exercises. He had witnessed the full might of the wall guns open up, hundreds if not thousands of cannons of every caliber blanketing an area. It was a show of force he had considered awe-inspiring. And yet it was a petty showing compared to the fire he was receiving now. He could no longer even hear the individual explosions, just one enormous, long, consistent roar, buffeting his tank, seemingly penetrating its thick armored walls to catch the sheer cacophony within his vehicle. All other source of noise was lost. He could no longer hear his tank's engine. He could no longer hear the discharge of its cannon, even as he saw it buck in its cradle as another Ferrozoican armored vehicle was destroyed. The only reason he knew something had been hit was because of a blossom of fire seen through his rangefinders. Even the words of his fellow commanders shouted in his earpiece was barely audible. And what little he could pick up told him that the mounted infantry attached to his armored spearheads was suffering terribly, being quite literally shattered by the enemy's artillery. He could do nothing but hope that his forces could weather this apocalyptic storm, and weather it they did for many, many minutes until miraculously the barrage began to lift and shift away from them. Breathing a sigh of relief, the general thought that perhaps the Ferrozoicans had run low on ammunition. Perhaps this was another part of the ploy, to attempt to overwhelm the Vervun Primary forces in an enormous barrage, shattering their morale, a battlefield tactic. But looking around and calling in reports, he still had significant armored forces under his command. The mounted infantry had suffered dreadfully, but it too was still a force to be considered. And surely the Ferrozoican light armored forces must be beginning to run out of steam by now. His troops must have destroyed hundreds upon hundreds of their armored vehicles, and slaughtered thousands of supporting infantry. The back of the Ferrozoican army must be breaking, and if it was not, it soon would be, until he leant into his observation scope yet again, and from the command cupola of his Lehman Russ main battle tank he observed a sight that seemed inconceivable. A solid wall of ochre-colored armor coming towards him like some dreadful tidal wave of steel. Thousands upon thousands of tanks, hundreds of self-propelled guns seen in the distance behind them, and further still tens of thousands of armored personnel carriers, of trucks and of tractors carrying yet further guns. His force was not merely outnumbered. It was of such insignificance that the enemy's advanced scouting forces had not been engaging the Vervun Primary armor. They had simply been passing through them, as one might infantry outposts during a massed border invasion. And as General Vergolin observed the incoming mass of armor, it flashed and fired in unison. A last desperate order to resist died on the general's lips as his world was transformed into fire and shattered metal. As the expeditionary armored army of Vervunhive ceased to exist. After the battle, although one really could only call it a battle if one felt some sense of pity towards the Vervun Primary forces who were destroyed in it. For the Ferrozoican forces certainly did not see it as one. It was barely even registered by their armies as they closed in on Vervunhive. They started setting up siege artillery pieces, super heavy cannons with range beyond virtually anything that had been seen on the planet before, and began to shell the Hive proper. They had clearly taken their time to infiltrate Vervunhive before the war had begun, as they had identified important through passes, highways, arteries of the Hive and the city, its massive urban sprawl, barracks, gathering yards, any and all point of strategic value had been pre-mapped and targeted. So that when the first shells, each the size of a ground car, began to strike the Hive just before nightfall, they did tremendous damage to the Hive, the city sprawl, the outlying districts, and its infrastructure. And yet, despite the shelling, the city's shields were not raised. The High Master of Vervunhive, Salvador Sondar, was ensconced within his sensory tank, as he was virtually all the time these days, and refused anyone entrance to his quarters to talk to him. The bombardment would continue for quite some time, a disturbingly long period in which thousands lost their lives, until finally, deep within his tank, Salvador Sondar himself realized that his city was taking damage. The Hive was hurting. But this was impossible. He had received every reassurance from Ferrozoica of friendship. He had spoken to Ferrozoica on multiple occasions. They were his allies, his close confidants. And any suggestion that they might declare war upon him or harm him in any way was ridiculous, right? Just like those mewling noises from one of the High Council's representative, a man whose blood was currently soaking into the carpet of the High Master's office. But the Hive was taking damage. This was the only thing that Salvador Sondar knew for sure. And so he decided he needed time to make sense out of this seemingly absurd situation. And so finally, the shields were raised, and the shells stopped falling on the Hive and the inner city, splashing instead harmlessly on the massive energy umbrella erected over the Hive by a multitude of shield pylons. This was, of course, little comfort for the millions of individuals working in the outskirts of the Hive city. Well over 15 million people either lived outside the house or had employment outside of it. And the simple fact that it was nearing night time was no reason to assume that these areas were unoccupied. The industry of the Imperium runs always, regardless of whether it is night or day. The day shift would simply be the fortunate ones that escaped the slaughter. The rest of the 15 million were now stuck outside of the Hive's primary bastion walls and could only re-enter it through a handful of massive fortified gates. And the overwhelming majority would have to do so on foot, as most of those who were working in the outskirts had arrived via mag trains, and all of the mag train stations and connections had been destroyed in the opening bombardment. There was no re-entering Vervunhive through those ports. and those who lived in the outer city were mostly too poor to afford any sort of conveyance whatsoever. Those who did have a conveyance was no doubt utilizing it this very moment to head towards the fortress gates and the relative safety of Vervunhive itself. Tens of thousands of civilians would die in the press to reach those fortress gates, either crushed by their fellow Imperial citizens in the maddened stampede to reach safety, or blasted to pieces as enormous artillery shells fell into the throngs of retreating refugees as the Ferrozoican guns retrained their barrels on the outer city. And the cruelest fate of all was visited upon refugees streaming through Sondar Gate. The gate through which the Vervun Primary forces had issued so proudly shortly before, and the gates that aforementioned armored survivors were attempting to traverse yet again, but now in maddened retreat. But the gates, of course, and the paths and roadways leading up to the gates were all chock full of refugees. The armor could move no further, even as the Ferrozoicans were closing in on their tail, even as artillery shells continued to fall amongst them. This is when Commissar Pius Cowell, having assumed command after the death of General Vergolan, issued his order to all surviving Vervun Primary Armored Forces elements to drive forward towards the gates and through them as if there was nothing in their way, and to clear the path with heavy bolters and stubbers if needed. A cold-blooded decision that would have been labeled an unexcusable atrocity in any other situation. But not in this situation. Vervunhive needed every tank destroyer, every self-propelled gun, and every soldier it could possibly get right now. And if that came at the cost of a few thousand civilians that none would ever know were slain by their own, well, sacrifices are as always a necessity in war. As for the command structure of the Hive itself, the various leaders of the noble houses of Gavunda, Yech, Rodin, Anko, Crow, Pidestro, Nomfrenti, and Vivek had been arguing loudly and insistently for quite some time now. They had seen the coming war with Ferrozoica from quite some distance away. They had seen the rise in tension. They had beseeched the Hive Master Salvador Sondar to do something, to begin preparations, to reach out to the other hives, but they had been ignored again and again. And just as a rebellious mood began to set in, Salvador Sondar revealed himself to the crowd and reassured them that all would be well, that the shields had been raised, that all necessary measures were being taken, and furthermore, that the Imperium was asked for its aid in the war against the Ferrozoican madness. He received a standing ovation for his declaration, even though some amongst the crowd did so out of politeness rather than genuine exuberance, having noticed that this was not actually Salvador Sondar at all, but rather one of his servitors, a fancy flesh puppet, one of the deviant Hive Master's fetishes. Crafting beautiful if disturbing-looking servitors to attend him in his sensory tank. In general, there were many amongst the noble houses who were not particularly fond of Salvador Sondar, who viewed him as an apple that had fallen some significant distance from the tree of his forefathers, a indolent, lazy master at best, and an incompetent danger at worst. But this was not the time to make a move against the Hive master. And so, a period of relative political unity came across the Hive, as the remnants of the Vervun Primary armored forces were brought into the city, and Commissar Pyre's Cowl was dubbed the hero of the people for his efforts in rescuing the remnants of the expeditionary force. And with the death in battle, of course, of the previous commander of the Vervun Primary Forces, General Vergolin, new commanders needed to be elected in this time of war. The House Legislature came together and named 2 new representatives. The new Supreme Commander of Vervunhive and all its armed forces would be Marshal Edric Crow, answerable only to Salvador Sonda. And as an immediate political counterweight to focusing so much power in the hands of one family, the Crows, he was immediately also appointed a second-in-command, General Hesketh Anko, who would be his dutiful adjutant, and also rapid replacement should the Marshal overstep. And with Imperial Guard forces on the way, of course, both of these commanders would also have at the very least an equal, and probably in all due essentiality a superior, in the highest ranking Imperial Guard officer, which just happened to be our old familiar friend, General Noches Sturm, and his Royal Vulpen. And whilst the general had brought with him a fairly significant Imperial Guard force, it was not an enormous one. The Imperial Guard came to Vervunhive assuming that they would participate in a local Verghastian conflict, that they were outsiders come to give a helping hand to settle this dispute as rapidly as possible, and that they would find 2 loyal Imperial forces where their show of force might very well be enough to settle the whole thing right then and there. Still, to manage to settle something swiftly, a show of force is required. Thus, Noches Storm brought with him the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd Royal Vulpen regiments, in addition to, presumably, the Vulpen 50th, as another acquaintance of ours, Gizom Danver de Banzi Heit Gilbert, was also on world. The Major, of course, was the commander of the Royal Vulpen 50th, which was also Noches Sturm's personal regiment, so it seems unlikely he would have left them behind. In addition to the Vulpen forces also came the 5th and the 7th Rowan Deepers regiments under the command of General Nash, along with the Tarnith 1st and only under the command of Colonel Ibrahim Gaunt, and 3 regiments of Narmenian armor, under another old acquaintance of ours, Coron Grismund, the inspired armored commander that had secured victory on the world of Kokiamenus. He had by now been promoted to the rank of general, but Noches Sturm was his senior and therefore in de facto command over the more recently elevated Grismund. All in all, the Imperial Guard reinforcements probably numbered around 20 to 30,000 men, although exact numbers are difficult to estimate because the Imperium absolutely loathes any form of standardization whatsoever ever. But the Imperium were not the only ones rallying to the side of Vervunhive. As mentioned previously, the trade war against Ferrozoica nearly 100 years ago was won by an alliance of Hive cities, an alliance still largely intact. Thus, Vervunhive could call upon the aid of the northern colonies, whom dispatched another 10 regiments, with a further 9 regiments also arriving from Hive. This would add another 50, 60, 70,000 or so men to the already existing 500,000 of Vervun Primary troops. Thus, in total, Vervunhive was protected by somewhere in excess of 600,000 professional soldiers, in addition to the aforementioned 70,000 auxiliaries, and by now, in all due likelihood, tens of thousands of militia forces, recruited from amongst the various workers flooding into the Hive from the rapidly ruined outer parts of the city. The refugees were another problem as well. Flooded by millions upon millions of homeless refugees, the logistical system of Vervunhive was beginning to creak and moan under the strain. They would need housing, they would need feeding, they would need access to clean water and medical facilities. Not to mention, of course, all of the casualties that the Vervun Primary forces had suffered in their ill-advised sally out against the Ferrozoicans. Resources were already beginning to run a little bit dangerously low, and the ability to bring up further resources from the enormous, seemingly inexhaustible stores deep beneath the city of Vervunhive were being complicated by the fact that so much of the city's logistical infrastructure had been damaged or outright destroyed in the opening barrages. Even the Imperial Guard forces would be ill-affected by the logistical nightmare that Vervunhive was quickly becoming, as they were all deposited outside of the city and had to be transported over and into it across the Haas River. There were some major arteries still operational crossing the river, but a lot of Imperial Guard regiments needed to be moved over using barges and boats, even as the city was attempting to move some of the refugee hordes over into the outer Habs on the north shore of Vervunhive. An enormous and frankly somewhat hopeless affair, but it seemed better to at least shift some of the burden out of the Hive rather than sit upon all of it. And even then, those trapped within Vervunhive, now struggling for access to food, medical personnel, and water, were a whole lot better off than the millions still outside the city. As after desperate struggles to keep the Ferrozoicans away, the mass-fortified gates of the various fortress entrances to Vervunhive were closed shut and barred on the 6th day, with, again, as mentioned, millions upon millions of refugees still outside thronging for entrance. And unfortunately, they were about to get a lot of company, as millions of Ferrozoican troops, too, began to move into the outskirts of the Hive city's sprawl, and prepare their assault on Vervunhive, whose defenders were only now beginning to realize the full scale of what they were facing. And the introduction of additional Imperial Guard commanders would, at first at least, do little more than unfocus the defenders' efforts, as everyone had an idea of how to best defend Vervunhive and how best to bring Verghast back to Imperial compliance as quickly as possible. Especially as the true face of the enemy had yet to be revealed. What will happen next, however, we will see in next week's video, as the battle for Vervunhive is, as I mentioned at the start, going to be a very large and very involved affair. Until then, I have been Arch, Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see all of you again soon. Till then, have a good day.